Okay, welcome to the dermis. We've talked about the epidermis. Now we're going to move down into the deeper of the two major layers of the skin, and that's going to be the dermis. The dermis is also the thicker of the two major layers of the skin. Alright, so we've talked about how the epidermis is composed of stratified squamous epithelial tissues. And so you've got jam-packed, tightly packed together cells, which is typical of an epithelial tissue. Now down in the dermis, you have a connective tissue, or you have connective tissues of a couple of different types that we'll talk about, mainly a couple of different types. And much of the dermis is very strong. It's also very flexible, which means it can move in different directions, and it can bend and be squished. And you guys know that your skin is flexible. All right, so when we went over the epidermis, we mentioned the types of cells you would expect to find there. The cells that you would find in the dermis include fibroblasts. You guys remember those were your main cell type in your connective tissues, many of your connective tissues. Macrophages. Macrophages, again, are like your body's vacuum cleaners that clean up damage, attack and digest things like bacteria and viruses. You have mast cells, which are, we talked about those a little bit in chapter 4. They signal your immune system to come in and clean up damage, fight off infections when you get injured, burned, or you have an infection. And white blood cells are involved in those processes as well. So you will find all of these different things down in those cell types in the dermis. The dermis can be divided up into two sublayers. So the epidermis, you had several. The dermis, you have a sublayer called the papillary sublayer, and then the reticular sublayer underneath that. All right, so let's bring up our generic skin chunk diagram here. So again, pretty much everything you see there shaded in pink is the dermis, and then the papillary sublayer. All right, so if you get the bottom deep end of the epidermis is wavy. So wherever you have portions of the dermis extending upward, poking upward into the epidermis, that's your papillary sublayer. So you can see over here on this diagram, they're actually peeling the epidermis off, so you can kind of see the papillary sublayer of the dermis in 3 dimensions. You can kind of see how you've got a series of hills or bumps there. Each hill or bump is called a papilla. Papillae is the plural form of that word. That's really what papilla. You'll see that more than once during your A&P careers. That term refers to something that kind of has a hill-like appearance. So that sublayer is fairly thin. Most of your dermis consists of this reticular sublayer, so that's everything else until you hit the fatty tissues of the hypodermis deep to that particular sublayer. Alright, the reticular layer is also where you're going to find all of these other nice, interesting things there on the skin chunk that we'll talk about in additional video lectures for Chapter 5. Alright, a little bit more about that papillary layer. Some people like to think of the papillary sublayer as like if you had the epidermis modeled as a piece of Play-Doh and you stuck your fingers up into the Play-Doh, your fingers would be like the papillae of your papillary sublayer. Alright, your book I like to call it the papillary sublayer. That way we're distinguishing between the major skin layers, the epidermis and the dermis, distinguishing those from the divisions of the epidermis or the divisions of the dermis, which would be our sublayers. Alright, the papillary sublayer consists of areolar type connective tissue. If you remember that from Chapter 4, that is a loose connective tissue. So it does have collagen and elastic fibers in it. You just don't have as many as you would in a dense type of connective tissue. Don't forget your functions: collagen fibers, tensile strength, resist pulling. Elastic fibers help you with rebound. When something gets stretched, it rebounds the tissue back into place. You also have blood vessels in the papillary sublayer. If we back up over here, like right over in here on the diagram, you can see you have very small blood vessels over here as well, extending up into those papillae, and so those are going to serve as the blood supply for the epidermis. Remember, we talked before about how you don't have blood vessels up in the epidermis. That's an epithelial tissue, so they have to get their oxygen and their nutrients from the blood vessels that are in the connective tissues that underlie the epidermis. All right, some other things that you would find there in the dermal papillae include Meissner's corpuscles, and those are nervous system structures that are involved in touch sensation. Now, we talked about Merkel cells a little bit in the epidermis that also play roles in touch sensations. Well, these Meissner's corpuscles do that as well. You also have some free nerve endings. Nerve endings in the dermis will play roles in detecting things like pain. They'll send, if you have skin damage or somebody's pinching you in the skin, you have nerves that detect that damage and send signals to the brain so that you'll perceive pain in that area, and you'll stop doing whatever is causing the pain, or you'll get away from whatever is causing the pain. You also have nerve endings that detect things, pressure, heat, things like that. So if we back up to our diagram over here again, you can see those. It's kind of hard to see. Let's see. You guys might be able to see this pretty well. The little yellow things there represent nervous tissue in the skin. Those little nerve endings do extend all the way up to the border with the epidermis there. Oh, the Meissner's corpuscles. Let's see. They don't have one. Looks like they don't have one drawn on this particular diagram, so I will but we'll take a look at that on the anatomy section for chapter 5. They're sitting up in those papillae there of the dermis. All right, how about the reticular layer? Reticular, whenever you see that, again, that tends to refer to something that's web-like. And this layer of the dermis is called the reticular layer because there are lots and lots of protein fibers in there, collagen and elastic fibers, and they run in all different directions, like that, all over the place. And so that gives those fibers kind of a web-like appearance. So that's why it's called the reticular layer or sublayer. Again, I prefer to call these the sublayers. Of the dermis. Alright, so the reticular layer makes up about 80% of the thickness. Lots of collagen, lots of elastic fibers. This is the part of the skin that really gives your skin its strength and resiliency. So again, like we talked about before when we did chapter 4, because of all those collagen fibers in this portion of the dermis, you can't just easily rip skin chunks off. Your skin resists tearing and pulling pretty well, and the elastic fibers that are there help rebound the skin when it does get stretched or pulled so that it retains its shape. And as you guys know, those types of things tend to break down as you get a little bit older. Let me back up to my skin chunk over here for a second. The other thing you'll notice in the reticular layer of the dermis, all these additional accessory structures in there, and we will discuss those and what they do in their own little video lectures as we continue here with chapter 5.